I'm Joe Lample. When I created Growing a Greener World, I had one goal: to tell stories of everyday people, innovators, entrepreneurs, forward-thinking leaders who are all, in ways both big and small, dedicated to organic gardening and farming, lightening our footprint, conserving vital resources, protecting natural habitats, making a tangible difference for us all. They're real, they're passionate, they're all around us. They're the game changers who are literally growing a greener world and inspiring the rest of us to do the same. Growing a Greener World, it's more than a movement, it's our mission. With so much time on the road hosting and producing this show, it's been pretty difficult to have a full-time garden of my own and keep it looking good all the time. So I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands and make this the year that all changes. And this time, I'm going all out. Call it making up for some lost time. My family and I found a 5-acre farmstead property just north of Atlanta that we now call home. Once I tamed the overgrown land from several years of neglect, the first order of business is a large raised bed vegetable garden, built from scratch. When we bought this property, there was a ton of work to do here, both inside and out. Along with the typical maintenance of a fresh coat of paint and some serious landscape renovation, this property needed a vegetable garden. So you really think you're going to get all those trees done in a day?
Yes, sir.
Okay, glad I have some good skill on the job, Mark. Thank you. All right, so this is a really big day here at the GGW Farm and Garden. It's the first day of real construction, and we have some housekeeping to do before we ever get the raised beds in the ground. See all those hollies right there? Well, they're actually in the way of where the raised beds are going to go, so I need to make some room for that. Mark's going to dig them all up and move them back about 15 feet. But it all starts with the soil, right? I mean, come on, you know me, I love my soil. And this is some great stuff from just up the street. Now, this has got compost and lots of organic matter and some sand for good consistency. I really like this. And you know what? That's not even going in the raised beds. That's going to go over the roots of the hollies to protect them, and with a little help from Mother Nature, and we should be just fine. The location I picked for my garden was ideally suited for several reasons. First, it had all-day sun, and that's important no matter what size garden you're starting with. So make that the first step in deciding where to place your food garden. How much sunlight is enough? Well, for vegetable gardening, ideally about 8 hours a day. You can get by on a little less, but your garden won't be quite as productive. It may even be a small strip on the side of your house or your garage or carport, but wherever it is that you can find the most sun, that makes for the best location for a productive food garden, even if it's your front yard. Now, for this new garden space, having a large garden was really important, so I decided on a plot size of 40 by 72 feet. That would allow for 16 raised beds. Now, that's certainly much larger than the typical family food garden, but then this isn't your typical garden. We plan on using this garden a lot for the show, which means growing a lot of food, experimenting with different varieties and techniques, and sharing that information with you. So we picked a location that was large enough for that, yet was conveniently located to the house. And that's another important consideration. A garden of any size needs your attention, and the more convenient it is to the house, the more likely you are to keep an eye on it. Equally important is access to water. Vegetable plants require consistent moisture, so access to a water source will make your gardening life a lot easier. Now, when it came time to decide what type of beds to put into my new garden, I could have taken a number of routes. And one good option is the classic in-ground mounded bed. Now, beds like these are certainly the cheapest to make because they don't require any extra material to put them together. But because there isn't anything holding them in place, you'll have to do some ongoing maintenance throughout the season and in between seasons if you want to come back to these same beds and shape next season. Now, keep this in mind. Because the beds are so low to the ground, they're very accessible to those crawling critters. So if you have an exposed garden, there's a good chance they're going to get to it. Another important consideration for beds at ground level. Chances are your native soil isn't perfect, and you're going to be incorporating some of that soil into the mounded area. So if you have heavy clay soil, for example, you need to break that up. Or if you have sandy soil, you need to add something to help retain the moisture. Now, a good solution for both is compost, and this is a good example of that. These beds are very well amended, they're nice and high. This is a really productive garden, and compost was the answer for that. If you want to contain your beds, there are many options, from logs and branches to cinder blocks to lumber and even recycled plastic timbers. Ann Myers has been an avid organic vegetable gardener for years, and she came across these recycled plastic timbers at a local box store, so she decided to give them a try in her garden. The timbers are guaranteed for decades, and once they're in place, don't plan on moving them because they're very heavy. One of the best advantages of this type of material is their uniform shape and stackability. Plus, the plastic is so good at retaining heat and considers them great season extenders in her garden, adding about 10 degrees of heat to the surrounding soil. In my case, we chose untreated 6x6 cedar timbers, stacked 3 rows high. Admittedly, this was a substantial upfront investment, but my intent was to build a garden to last, and these timbers were a great choice. So what's happening here is I want a perfect rectangle, and we're sort of out in open space, and we don't have any real solid reference points to get us that exact rectangle without a mathematical equation. With the help of my neighbor Michael, we worked from a plan that I created on graph paper to give us just what we needed on the ground. Placing rebar stakes in the 4 corners of the garden plot and then connecting those with string, we were able to get the base foundation for the garden area perfectly aligned. Once I knew we had the right foundation, I began measuring out the garden beds in the actual plot. Once you define your outside perimeter and clearly mark the borders, it's easy to start getting each bed marked as well. Bright nylon string, some sturdy stakes or spikes, and a trusty tape measure helps this part of the job go a lot faster. It started by preparing the timbers for the proper dimensions. Each bed was 12 feet by 4 feet. A large radial saw provided the best tool for cutting these large pieces to size quickly. Once the beds were defined and the timbers cut, it was time to lay the first course. Okay, so day 2, everyone's already hard at work. Plenty of more wood to cut, but now look what's happening. We're getting the logs into place over here. And what they're doing is they're looking at this grid pattern that I've set up. Spent a good bit of time yesterday lining out these strings. Now this string is a road map. It's a guide to exactly where those logs go. The reason for that is important because it makes sure that everything is going to be perfectly aligned in the end, and it gives me a good chance to double check my work before any of this even happens. At this point, it's really important to make sure the first layer of each bed is level. This part of the job can be a bit tedious, but it's well worth it in the end. The integrity of the beds is better, and overall the garden will look much better too. Once the first layer was level, we secured the timbers to each other with 12-inch weather-resistant screws. We then drilled several holes down through the timbers and drove 24-inch rebar spikes into the ground for added stability. Next, it was time for the second layer. This course was staggered from the first to add even more stability to the overall bed. Each timber was again secured with 12-inch screws on the sides, just as the first layer. Then 12-inch galvanized spikes were driven through this layer and into the first. Finally, the third row was added, again staggering the timbers and securing the final layer with more screws and spikes. If you'd like the details on how to build these garden beds, you can find the plans on our website under the show notes for this episode at growingagreenerworld.com. With 16 large raised beds now in place, it was time to add the soil. The first order of business was to determine exactly how much soil is needed. Fortunately, there are many online calculators to help you determine that. All you need to know is the total square footage and the height. The calculator will convert that into the total number of cubic yards of soil needed. All right, so we've made some progress in the last few days. All the soil that we need for the raised beds is here, some of that great topsoil and even some certified compost and even fill dirt for that final grade. The barn even has a fresh coat of paint. So now it's time to fill the raised beds. It's hard work, but it's progress. For these beds, I blended 3 parts topsoil with 1 part certified compost and 1 part composted manure. This gives a nice blend of ingredients in the finished mix, plus it helps a lot with the budget, since the manure is free and the topsoil is cheaper than the compost, yet all provide important components to the final blend. For the main ingredients of topsoil and compost, I found a great bulk source provider for both close by. If possible, I recommend that you even go by and inspect the facility that will be providing the soil. You'll want to make sure that you're comfortable with the ingredients that they're using to make the soil. It's also a good idea to get to know your supplier. Chances are you'll need more eventually, and having a source you can trust is a valuable asset to your long-term success. In my case, this provider made the composted topsoil, certified compost, and mulch I'd be using around the garden beds. I needed bulk quantities of each, and it's always cheaper buying it this way if you need a lot. Just be sure the quality is what you expect. As for the manure, we sourced that right here on the property. With horses, chickens, and goats, I had a generous inventory of manure that had been composting for months. It's important though that you don't use fresh manure in your garden beds because at this stage, the nitrogen is too concentrated and it can burn your plants. Letting it mellow over time gives you the best of both worlds. Animals of all kinds seem to be one of the biggest challenges to vegetable gardeners everywhere. Dr. Mike Minjak is the wildlife specialist at the University of Georgia, so I stopped by for a visit to get his insight on what works and what doesn't.
Things that don't work: peeing on your plants, going to the barbershop and getting hair, soap, pie pans. Now these things can work occasionally for a little while, especially things like pie pans, which work like a scare tactic, just like a scarecrow. But if you don't move them around, the deer or any animal are going to become real accustomed to them very, very quickly. Things like human hair, I always tell people, you're in your yard and your dog is in your yard and you're working there all the time, so it's just not logical that you could go to the barbershop, get some hair and stick it in your garden, and all of a sudden that's going to scare deer when they're used to your smell around there all the time anyway. So that stuff's just not proven effective. There's no evidence that it works. That we recommend sometimes as a harassment or a scare technique for birds, not so much for rabbits and deer. It really doesn't seem to have a lot of impact on those animals. A lot of wise tales, a lot of urban legends, but we don't recommend those kind of things that haven't been tested.
All across the country, deer seem to be the biggest challenge no matter what you're growing on your property. Beyond the vegetable garden, plants all throughout our landscapes are targets, so finding plants that are resistant is important.
Resistance comes from a couple of different categories. Physical resistance, like thorns on locust, spines on blackberry, the hairs that would be, say, on like a stinging nettle that would irritate the tongue or the mucous membranes of the deer.
Okay.
And then the other category would be chemicals, alkaloids, resins, tannins, alkaloids that would be toxic and bitter, resins that again just give the plant a foul taste, tannins that interfere with digestion. These would be found in things like nightshade, lupines, fiddleheads. Those kind of plants would be deer resistant from those chemicals.
Okay, so the question then is, really, is there any such thing as a deer-proof plant?
Yeah, one that's behind a good strong fence.
I was afraid you were going to say that. So let's get right down to the thing that we all want to know. We're at home, we have a deer problem, and we don't want those deer eating our plants. We've learned already that physical exclusion is pretty much the only surefire way to make sure that's not going to happen.
Can be.
But we're talking about a fence like this. This is here out at your research property.
Right.
You've got some sort of orchard growing in the background, and it looks like so far so good. No
so
damage.
far it's working pretty well. It looks like it's keeping the deer off there. They're not eating them, they're not rubbing their antlers on them, they're not tearing them up, knocking them over. It's working pretty well. A fence like this is not that complicated. It's a 4x4 treated lumber post buried a couple of feet in the ground, a post hole digger, and put it down in the ground. It doesn't have to be concrete or anything like that. Pack the dirt around it after you dig the hole. You want to go up about, there's probably a 10-foot post, so you have 2 feet in the ground, and you want about 7 or 8 feet of wire on the fence.
I was looking at this fence earlier. In fact, if you come down here, you can see that it's really taut in the ground, like it's buried.
That's critical. You want to either bury it or have it real tight to the ground. You don't want any gaps under it. Deer would rather go under a fence than over it. So any place you have dips in the ground, any any culverts or any low spots. You want to make sure that the fence is down tight to the ground, even if you have to bury it or stake it down to the ground.
Now, they're not diggers, but they'll look for that low
They look
dip.
for that low spot. It's easier for them to get in. It's safer for them to get in. You take a deer going under a fence, there's not much chance of injury. You take that same deer and he leaps a 7 or 8 foot fence and lands on the other side, there's a high risk that he's going to break a leg, and that's not a good thing for him. Or you're going to have a deer with a broken leg inside your fence, so that's not a good thing. So they don't like to jump, they're capable of it, but they'd rather go under.
Now, as effective as these tall fences are for keeping just about any animal out, they're not very practical in a neighborhood setting, to say nothing about the aesthetics, especially in the front yard. In fact, most neighborhood covenants and restrictions wouldn't even allow such a fence. Fortunately, new barrier options are being trialed, and the results look promising. So this is the fence you wanted to talk about?
This is the other kind of design that we were speaking of.
All right, this looks really simple. This is something I could easily do. Tell me about what we're dealing with here.
Well, this is a 3-strand fence. It's sold as livestock protection, but it works very well for deer in our test. It's a post in the ground. This is a wooden treated lumber post. It could be fiberglass, it could be metal. The insulator is attached to the post. Just simple wire, long spools, very inexpensive. The first strand's 18 inches off the ground.
Okay.
On the second fence, the bottom wire is 10 inches off the ground. The top wire is 24 inches off the ground. And what's critical is the depth, it's about 3 feet apart.
And the reason for that, explain that.
Well, deer, we think, don't have very good depth perception. They don't see depth the same way we do. So it forms a visual barrier to them. They don't understand that they can leap across this. They tend to hop inside and get stuck, and then that scares them and they hop back out. So they don't see it as something they could cross. They see it as more of a barrier than it really is, but it's effective to them.
As for the success rate in trials, it's been tested with and without adding electricity. Without it, it's simply a physical but effective barrier. They hit it, and a lot of times they'll just turn and go someplace else. In one study, with the electricity, it kept the deer off the soybeans with very little browsing damage, compared to unprotected soybeans on the outside. It's not 100% foolproof, but it does the job. And the electricity is really easy to add, even if you're in a remote location, because now there are battery-operated or solar-powered chargers. Well, Mike, I really love this fence. I know a lot of people watching are going to try to make this at home, including myself. What's really great is the low cost, the simplicity to install it, and then the ability to take it away. And if you want to know more about this fence and the research behind it, well, we're going to have that information on a link on our website at growingagreenerworld.com. You'll find it in the show notes for this episode. Your research is really paying off, because I think this is the kind of thing that we need to know about.
Well, thank you.
After spending time with Mike, I was armed with ideas to implement my own fence needs. I really wanted a cedar split rail fence to complement the wood used in the raised beds. But without more protection, the rails alone wouldn't stop much of anything. So I added 2x4 vinyl coated wire to the inner perimeter. That will stop most small to medium-sized animals, and it's subtle enough to not detract from the look of the garden. But with a fence at only 4 feet high, my biggest threat are the deer. Now, deer are all around here, and I know that they can easily jump over an obstacle of only 4 feet. But here's my theory. It's widely believed that deer don't like to jump into confined spaces. And inside this fence line, it's pretty tight. So I'm hoping that rather than jump in my garden to do their eating, they'll do their browsing out there. Now, if I'm wrong, we'll make some adjustments, but time will tell. But if I'm right, I get to keep my fence at only 4 feet high. Well, now that all the garden construction is complete, the real fun can begin, and that's when you add the plants. And fortunately, seeds and seedlings just aren't that expensive. So if that 4 foot high fence doesn't turn out to be quite high enough, we'll just make some adjustments. And that's part of the fun, to me, of gardening, is the experimenting. And I'll certainly keep you posted on how it works out. Well, with so much time spent in other people's gardens in recent years, I've got some serious catching up to do in my own garden. And everything's finished now except for the planting, and now it's time for that. If you'd like to learn more about what you saw today, including how to build the beds that we put in this garden, well, we have that information under the show notes for this episode. And the address, that's the same as our name. It's growingagreenerworld.com. I'm Joe Lample. Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you back here next time for more Growing a Greener World. Pass the baton. This is a ceremony the final day. Once this goes in, we are finished. Nothing like a little pressure. All right, guys. Yeah. Woo! Feeling pretty good right now. We're ahead of schedule.